I found a friend looking for gay sex on Grindr. He's publicly straight and engaged to a female mutual friend. What do I do? I'm openly gay and single. No shame in me being on Grindr, though my public pics only show me from the neck down and I share my face in DMs. I get flirty messages from a similar faceless profile. He's seriously DTF right now. We agree to exchange faces. He sends his first. It's Leo, a friend I've known since elementary school. He's engaged to Lisa, a close friend of mine. They're getting married this October and I already RSVP'd to their wedding. I did not send my face back and Leo is sending me frustrated and horny DMs about how our kinks are so aligned and I have a sexy body, etc. I'm panicking. This is happening right now. What do I do? Sorry if this is the wrong way to post an update. Things have been hard here. Lisa met me for coffee. I showed her evidence of Leo on Grindr. She believed me, all right. She cried. I tried to comfort her. She recoiled from me and started ramming into me. Apparently, I ruined her life. I led Leo astray. I am personally to blame for her fiancé cheating on her. I was trying to be understanding of her emotions and to comfort her anyway until the homophobic slurs started coming. She was always an LGBTQ ally, so it was a huge shock. I left quickly after that, feeling like shit. Lisa clearly told Leo it was me who outed him. He kept trying to call me. I refused all his calls. Then his car parked across the street from my apartment for some time, though he never got out of it. I'm in the dark, but it seems to me like Lisa and Leo are still together and they closed rank by designing me as the villain here somehow. So yeah, the bus rattled along the winding roads, taking me farther away from the town that had briefly felt like a refuge. I stared out the window, watching as the familiar landscape gave way to something new, something unknown. The fear still lingered, a shadow that clung to me no matter how far I traveled. But there was also a sliver of hope buried deep within that fear, a hope that maybe this time, I could finally outrun my past. For hours, the bus trundled along through towns and cities I didn't recognize. I felt like a ghost, drifting from place to place, leaving no trace of myself behind. I hadn't spoken to anyone since boarding the bus, and I kept my head down, avoiding eye contact with the other passengers. I didn't want to attract any attention, didn't want to give anyone a reason to remember me. I was a nameless face in a sea of strangers, and that was exactly how I wanted it to stay. Eventually, the bus pulled into a small station in a town I had never heard of. It was late afternoon, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty streets. I had no idea where I was, but something about the quiet, sleepy town called to me. It was far enough off the beaten path that I figured it might be safe, at least for a little while. I grabbed my bag and stepped off the bus, my legs stiff from the long ride. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of pine trees and distant wood smoke. The town was small, much smaller than the one I had just left, with a main street that consisted of a handful of shops, a diner, and a post office. There was a stillness to the place, a sense of isolation that made me feel both uneasy and strangely comforted. It was the kind of town where people kept to themselves, where outsiders weren't likely to be noticed, and that was exactly what I needed. I found a cheap motel on the edge of town, a rundown place with flickering neon lights and peeling paint. The owner was an elderly man who barely looked up from his newspaper as he handed me the key to my room. There was no need for small talk, no questions asked, just a simple exchange of cash for a bed to sleep in. I was grateful for the anonymity, for the lack of interest in who I was or where I came from. The room itself was nothing special, just a bed, a nightstand, and a small TV that looked like it hadn't worked properly in years. The walls were thin, and I could hear the muffled sounds of a TV blaring from the room next door. But it was a place to sleep, a place to regroup and figure out my next move. I dropped my bag on the floor and collapsed onto the bed, the exhaustion of the past few days finally catching up with me. My body ached from the constant tension, from the relentless stress of looking over my shoulder, and I fell into a fitful sleep almost as soon as my head hit the pillow. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside my window. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light across the room. For a brief moment, I forgot where I was, forgot about the fear that had driven me here. But reality quickly set in, and I felt the familiar weight of anxiety settle back into my chest. I knew I couldn't stay in the motel for long. It was too exposed, too easy to find. I needed to find a more permanent place to stay, somewhere I could blend in and disappear. I got dressed and headed out into the town, hoping to find something that could offer me a bit more security. As I walked down the main street, I noticed a small cafe with a "Help Wanted" sign in the window. I hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open and stepping inside. The place was cozy, with mismatched furniture and a chalkboard menu behind the counter. A middle-aged woman with graying hair and a warm smile stood behind the counter, wiping down a coffee machine. "Good morning," she greeted me with a smile. "What can I get for you?" I ordered a coffee and glanced at the "Help Wanted" sign again. The woman noticed and raised an eyebrow. "You looking for work?" she asked, her tone friendly but cautious. I nodded. "Yeah, just passing through, but I could use a job for a bit." She studied me for a moment, as if weighing her options. "We could use some help around here. Nothing fancy, just serving coffee, cleaning up, that sort of thing. Pay's not great, but it's steady." "That sounds perfect," I replied, relief washing over me. "When can I start?" "Tomorrow morning, if you're up for it," she said with a nod. "Name's Maggie, by the way. I run this place with my husband, Tom. We've been here for years." I introduced myself with a fake name, something generic and forgettable. Maggie didn't question it, just smiled and handed me a cup of coffee. "Welcome to the team," she said. I spent the rest of the day wandering around the town, getting a feel for the place. It was quiet, just as I had hoped, with little in the way of entertainment or nightlife. The kind of town where people went to bed early and rose with the sun. The more I explored, the more I felt like I had made the right choice in coming here. It was the perfect place to hide, to lay low until I figured out what to do next. That night, I returned to the motel and started planning my next steps. I needed to find a place to live, somewhere more permanent than a motel room. The cafe job would help with that, at least until I could save up enough money to move on again if necessary. I spent hours poring over classified ads and rental listings, looking for anything that might be within my budget. I finally found a small, one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town. It was a bit run down, but the rent was cheap, and it was far enough from the main part of town that I wouldn't be easily noticed. I called the number in the ad and arranged to meet the landlord the next day. The meeting went smoothly, and by the end of the week, I had moved into my new apartment. It was small and sparsely furnished, but it was mine, and it felt like a step toward reclaiming some semblance of stability. I spent the first few days cleaning and unpacking, trying to make the place feel like home. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Working at the cafe helped keep my mind occupied. The days were busy, with a steady stream of locals coming in for their morning coffee and breakfast. Maggie and Tom were kind, treating me like one of the family. The work was simple, repetitive, and it was exactly what I needed, something to keep my hands busy and my mind from wandering too much. But despite the routine, the fear never fully went away. I was constantly on guard, always aware of the possibility that Leo or Lisa could find me. Every time the door to the cafe opened, my heart would skip a beat, and I'd brace myself for the worst. But day after day passed, and there was no sign of them. Slowly, I began to relax, to let my guard down just a little. One evening, after a particularly long day at the cafe, I decided to take a walk through the nearby woods. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the trees, and the air was cool and fresh. It felt good to be outside, away from the noise and the stress. As I walked along the trail, I allowed myself to breathe deeply, to take in the beauty of the surroundings. But as I ventured deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I quickened my pace, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The silence of the woods, which had felt peaceful just moments before, now felt oppressive, like it was closing in around me. I forced myself to keep walking, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. But when I reached a small clearing, I stopped in my tracks. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was a figure. My heart leaped into my throat as I recognized the silhouette. It was Leo. He didn't move, just stood there, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I felt rooted to the spot, unable to move or speak, as fear paralyzed me. How had he found me? How long had he been following me? The silence stretched on, the tension between us palpable. Finally, Leo took a step forward, his expression unreadable. "I've been looking for you," he said, his voice low and calm, but with an edge that sent chills down my spine. I couldn't respond, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts at once. All the fear, all the anxiety I had been trying to push down came rushing back with a vengeance. This was it, the nightmare I had been running from had finally caught up to me. "I just want to talk," Leo continued, his tone almost pleading. "I need to explain everything." I shook my head, backing away slowly. "Stay away from me, Leo," I managed to say, my voice trembling. "I'm not here to hurt you," he insisted, taking another step closer. I need to make things right. Please, just hear me out." But I couldn't. I couldn't let him get any closer. Without thinking, I turned and bolted, running as fast as I could back, toward the town. I could hear him calling after me, but I didn't stop. The only thought in my mind was to get away, to put as much distance between us as possible. When I finally reached the edge of the woods and burst out onto the main road, I was breathless and trembling, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop running until I reached my apartment, slamming the door behind me and locking it. I collapsed against the door, gasping for breath, my mind a whirlwind of panic. Leo had found me. After all this time, after all the precautions I had taken, he had still managed to track me down. I didn't know what to do, didn't know how to protect myself from him. All I knew was that I had to leave again, had to keep running. But where could I go? How far could I run before he found me again? I spent the night in a state of restless terror, every creak and groan of the old apartment building making me jump. I didn't sleep, too afraid that Leo might show up at my door. When morning finally came, I was exhausted and on edge, but I knew I had to make a decision. I couldn't stay in this town. Leo knew where I was, and that meant I wasn't safe. I packed my bag once more, leaving behind everything else I had accumulated in my short time here. There was no point in holding on to material things. They were just a burden, something that could tie me down when I needed to be free. I left a note for Maggie and Tom, thanking them for their kindness and explaining that I had to leave town suddenly due to personal reasons. It was a vague excuse, but I hoped it would be enough. They didn't deserve to be dragged into this mess. With my bag slung over my shoulder, I walked to the bus station, my heart heavy with the knowledge that I was once again leaving behind a place that had felt like home. I bought a ticket to a city on the other side of the country, a place where I could disappear into the crowds and start over once more. As the bus pulled out of the station, I looked out the window at the town I was leaving behind. I wondered if I would ever find a place where I could truly be safe, where the ghosts of my past wouldn't haunt me. The road ahead was uncertain, but I knew I had no choice but to keep moving, to keep searching for that elusive piece. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how far I ran, no matter where I went, the past would always find a way to catch up with me. And as the miles stretched out before me, I couldn't help but wonder if I would ever be able to escape the shadow that Leo and Lisa had cast over my life. The miles rolled by as the bus carried me farther away from the small town and deeper into the unknown. The landscape changed from the quiet, rural countryside to the bustling outskirts of a larger city. The transition was almost symbolic, as if the peaceful life I had briefly touched was being swallowed up by the chaotic reality I could never quite escape. The bus terminal in the city was busy, a hive of activity with people coming and going, each wrapped up in their own lives. I stepped off the bus, my senses overwhelmed by the noise, the lights, the sheer volume of humanity around me. It was disorienting after the relative calm of the small town, but it was also a relief. Here, in this crowd, I could disappear. I could become just another face among thousands, unnoticed and unremarkable. I took a moment to collect myself, sitting on a bench near the terminal's entrance, my bag clutched tightly in my lap. The adrenaline from my encounter with Leo still coursed through my veins, keeping me on edge, but I forced myself to breathe deeply, to try to calm down. I needed a plan, but my mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. All I knew was that I couldn't stay here in the terminal for long. I had to keep moving. After a few minutes, I pulled out my phone and began searching for a place to stay. The city was full of options, from hostels to budget hotels, but I needed somewhere inconspicuous, somewhere that didn't ask too many questions. I found a small, no-name motel a few miles away from the terminal. It wasn't ideal, but it was cheap, and it would give me a place to regroup and figure out my next move. The taxi ride to the motel was short, but it gave me a chance to see more of the city. It was a sprawling metropolis, far larger than anywhere I had lived before. The buildings towered over the streets, a mix of old and new architecture, and the sidewalks were packed with people going about their daily lives. It was the kind of place where you could lose yourself, where anonymity was almost guaranteed, and that was exactly what I needed. The motel was as nondescript as I had expected, run down, with a flickering sign out front and a weary-looking receptionist who barely glanced at me as I checked in. The room was small and musty, with outdated furnishings and a faint smell of mildew. It wasn't much, but it was a place to sleep, and for now, that was all I needed. I dropped my bag on the bed and collapsed onto the worn-out mattress, my body finally giving in to the exhaustion that had been building for days. I stared up at the cracked ceiling, my mind spinning with everything that had happened. Leo had found me once, and I had no doubt he would try again. The thought made my stomach churn with anxiety, but I pushed it down, focusing instead on what I needed to do next. I couldn't stay in one place for too long, that much was clear. But constantly running wasn't sustainable either. I needed to think long-term, to figure out a way to protect myself from Leo and anyone else who might come looking for me. The only way to do that, I realized, was to disappear completely. Not just from Leo's radar, but from the world as I knew it. I needed to start over, to create a new identity, a new life where no one could find me. It was a daunting task, one that required more resources and connections than I currently had. But I was determined to do whatever it took to keep myself safe. I pulled out my phone and began searching for ways to change my identity, to erase my digital footprint, to disappear in a world where everyone was constantly connected. It was overwhelming, and the information was often contradictory or confusing, but I took notes, trying to piece together a plan. The first step, I realized, was to cut all ties with my old life. That meant getting rid of my phone, my social media accounts, anything that could be traced back to me. It was a painful decision, but I knew it was necessary. I couldn't risk leaving any breadcrumbs that Leo, or anyone else, could follow. I spent the next few hours methodically erasing myself from the internet. I deleted my social media profiles, canceled my email accounts, and wiped my phone of all personal data. It felt like I was erasing my own existence, like the person I had been was disappearing into the ether, leaving behind nothing but a blank slate. It was both terrifying and liberating. Once that was done, I turned my attention to the more practical aspects of disappearing, finding a new place to live, a new job, a new identity. The city was big enough that it offered plenty of opportunities, but I needed to be careful, to move slowly and deliberately. I couldn't afford any mistakes. I started by looking for a new apartment, somewhere out of the way, in a part of the city where I wouldn't be noticed. I found a small studio in a rundown building on the outskirts of the city, far from the tourist areas and the bustling downtown. The rent was cheap, and the landlord didn't ask too many questions, just what I needed. The apartment itself was a dump, tiny, with peeling paint and a window that looked out onto a brick wall. But it was mine, and it was safe, at least for now. I paid the first month's rent in cash and moved in the next day, leaving the motel behind without a second thought. Next, I needed a job. The cafe work had been fine in the small town, but here in the city, I needed something more low-key, something that wouldn't draw attention. I scoured the classifieds, looking for under-the-table work, anything that wouldn't require too much paperwork or identification. I eventually found a job at a warehouse on the edge of town, loading and unloading trucks. The hours were long, the work was grueling, and the pay was minimal, but it was cash in hand, and that was all I cared about. The days turned into weeks, and I settled into a new routine: work, sleep, repeat. I kept to myself, avoided making friends or getting to know my coworkers. I was just another nameless face in the city, and I intended to keep it that way. But despite the new life I was building, the fear never fully left me. I was always on edge, always looking over my shoulder, waiting for the day when Leo would show up again. And then, one day, it happened. I was on my way home from work, the sun already setting, casting long shadows across the city streets. I was tired, my muscles aching from another long shift at the warehouse, and my mind was focused on nothing more than getting home and collapsing into bed. But as I rounded the corner to my apartment building, I froze. There, standing in front of my building, was Leo. He was leaning against the wall, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. But the moment he saw me, he pushed off the wall and started walking toward me, his eyes locked on mine. My heart leaped into my throat, panic surging through me like a tidal wave. How had he found me? How was this even possible? I turned and ran, not caring where I was going, just desperate to get away. I could hear Leo calling my name, his footsteps pounding on the pavement behind me, but I didn't stop. I darted down an alley, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps, my mind racing with fear and desperation. I needed to lose him, to find somewhere to hide, but the city streets were unfamiliar, a maze of buildings and alleyways that all looked the same. Finally, I ducked into a narrow alley between two buildings, my back pressed against the cold brick wall as I tried to catch my breath. I listened for the sound of Leo's footsteps, for any sign that he was still following me, but the alley was silent. I peeked around the corner, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no sign of him. I had lost him, at least for now, but I knew this wasn't over. Leo had found me, and that meant he could find me again. My new life, the one I had fought so hard to build, was already crumbling around me. I needed to leave the city, to disappear again, but I didn't know where to go or how to escape this time. I waited in the alley until I was sure Leo was gone, then made my way back to my apartment as quickly as possible. I packed my bag once more, taking only what I could carry, and slipped out into the night. I couldn't risk going to the bus station this time. It was too obvious, too easy to track. Instead, I headed to the train station, hoping to catch a late-night train out of the city. The train station was almost empty, the few travelers there looking just as weary and lost as I felt. I bought a ticket for the next train, not caring where it was going, just needing to get away. The train was old and creaky, the seats worn and uncomfortable, but it was a means of escape, and that was all that mattered. As the train pulled out of the station, I stared out the window, watching the city lights fade into the distance. The fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of my mind, but there was also a grim determination. I was tired of running, tired of living in fear, but I knew I had no other choice. If I wanted to survive, I had to keep moving, keep one step ahead of Leo, no matter the cost. The journey was long and monotonous, the rhythmic clatter of the train on the tracks lulling me into a fitful sleep. I dreamed of the life I had left behind, of the friends I had lost, of the person I used to be before all of this. It was a bittersweet reminder of everything I had sacrificed, of the future I could never have. But when I woke, it was with a renewed sense of purpose. The train eventually pulled into a small, dusty station in the middle of nowhere. The town was even smaller than the one I had left before, little more than a few streets lined with old, weather-beaten buildings. It was the kind of place that time had forgotten, where people kept to themselves and strangers were noticed but not questioned. It was exactly what I needed. I stepped off the train, my bag slung over my shoulder, and took in my new surroundings. The air was dry and hot, the sun beating down from a cloudless sky. It was a stark contrast to the city, a place where life moved at a slower, more deliberate pace. I could feel the eyes of the few locals on me as I walked through the town, but I kept my head down, avoiding their gazes. I didn't want to make any connections, didn't want to leave any trace of myself behind. I found a small boarding house at the edge of town, a dilapidated old building run by an elderly woman who seemed more interested in her garden than in her tenants. She didn't ask for ID, just took my cash and handed me a key. The room was tiny, with a single bed, a dresser, and a window that overlooked the desert landscape. It was simple, unassuming, and, most importantly, it was safe. I settled into a new routine, much like the one I had established in the city. I found work at a local garage, fixing cars and doing odd jobs. The work was hard, but it was honest, and it kept my mind and body occupied. The days blurred together, one after the other, each one the same as the last. It was a quiet life, a life that allowed me to fade into the background, to become invisible. But the fear never truly left me. It lingered in the back of my mind, a constant reminder of the life I had left behind, of the people I had hurt, of the man who was still out there, searching for me. I didn't know how long I could keep running, how long I could stay ahead of Leo, but I knew I had to try. Months passed, and slowly, the town began to feel like home. I still kept to myself, still avoided making any close connections, but the fear had begun to dull, replaced by a cautious hope that maybe, just maybe, I had finally found a place where I could be safe. The locals grew used to my presence, accepting me as one of their own, even if they didn't know much about me. It was a fragile peace, one that I knew could be shattered at any moment, but it was all I had. And then, one day, everything changed. I was working at the garage, replacing a tire on an old pickup truck, when I saw a car pull up to the entrance. It was a sleek, black sedan, out of place in the dusty, worn-down town. The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out, tall and imposing, with an air of authority that made my heart skip a beat. I recognized him instantly, Leo. He had found me again. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm, to keep working as if nothing was wrong. I watched out of the corner of my eye as Leo spoke to the garage owner, his expression unreadable. The owner pointed in my direction, and Leo turned, his gaze locking onto mine. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The noise of the garage faded away, and all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. Leo started walking toward me, his steps slow and deliberate, and I knew that there was no running this time. There was no escaping the confrontation that was about to happen. "Long time no see," Leo said as he approached, his voice calm and measured, but with an undercurrent of tension that made my skin crawl. "You've been hard to find." I straightened up, wiping my hands on a rag, trying to appear composed even as fear twisted in my gut. "What do you want, Leo?" I asked, my voice steady despite the panic surging within me. Leo didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked around the garage, taking in the surroundings as if he were trying to make sense of the life I had built here. Finally, he turned his attention back to me, his gaze piercing. "I just want to talk," he said, echoing the words he had spoken the last time we had met. "I want to make things right." I couldn't help but laugh, a bitter sound that echoed in the cavernous space of the garage. "Make things right?" I repeated, shaking my head. "You've been chasing me across the country, ruining my life, and now you want to talk." Leo's expression softened, and for a moment, he almost looked remorseful. "I know I've made mistakes," he admitted, taking a step closer. "I've been angry, confused, but I've had time to think. I realize now that I've been blaming you for things that weren't your fault." I tensed, not sure if I could trust the change in his tone. "So what? You think we can just sit down and have a nice chat, pretend like everything's fine?" "I'm not asking for that," Leo said quietly. I want to apologize. For everything. For dragging you into this mess, for hurting you, for making you run. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." His words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. This wasn't the Leo the first had come to fear, the man who had turned my life into a living nightmare. This was the Leo the first had known years ago, the friend who had always been there for me, the person I had trusted. It was disorienting, and I didn't know whether to believe him or not. But even as I stood there, trying to make sense of the situation, the fear lingered. I had been running for so long, always looking over my shoulder, always expecting the worst. Could I really trust that Leo had changed, that he meant what he was saying? I don't know if I can trust you, I finally admitted, my voice raw with emotion. You've put me through hell, Leo. You've turned my life upside down. I know, Leo said, his voice soft. And I don't expect you to forgive me. I wanted to see you, to say I'm sorry. I've been trying to fix things with Lisa, trying to make amends for everything I've done. But I couldn't do that without making things right with you first. The mention of Lisa made my heart ache, a reminder of everything that had been lost. How is she? I asked, unable to stop myself. Leo looked down, his expression pained. She's doing okay. We're not together anymore. She couldn't forgive me for what happened, for what I did. But she's moving on, trying to rebuild her life. A heavy silence fell between us, the weight of everything unsaid hanging in the air. There was so much history between us, so much pain and betrayal, that it was hard to know where to start, or if we even should. Part of me wanted to believe Leo, to think that he was genuinely trying to make amends, but another part of me was too scared to let my guard down, too afraid of being hurt again.